Good evening, everybody. All right, so we're going to continue. My name is Greg Carr. I teach at Howard University, and a lot of Howard folks. We got one of our associate deans from the law school and his crew here, so that's good. We got alum and some of our undergraduate students are, yes, absolutely. We might as well give a hand to Howard. In fact, I was just talking to Erica, the young lady who talked about the HWCUs and the HBCUs. I don't like to use PWI because I don't like to make it's all going to have a normative language. So the historically white colleges might understand that our black colleges are among, if not the most diverse institutions in the country when you factor in the only reason there's still any affirmative action, if you read the Chouette case and the cases that really speak to this question of diversity and the conversation of economic diversity. When we start talking about economic diversity, there are students at black colleges that many of the HWCUs would never try to even imagine to admit, sitting right next to students who got into all of those schools. And nobody but the black colleges is trying to figure out how to educate all those population cohorts at the same time. With that in mind, let me introduce our panel and get out of their way. We're going to do about 40 minutes of this conversation and then open it up. Same format as the previous panel, which was excellent, by the way. And this report, From Access to Completion, thank you. This is going to be a very valuable document. We're going to pour over it with our students. In fact, we have about 500 in freshman seminar class right now. Many of them would be here, but they're there and I'm here, so they're mad. But they said we'll loan me for about an hour. Let's go around the horn and then we'll go forward. Marcy M.W. Foster, who's senior policy analyst, right? Senior policy analyst for the Center of Post-Secondary and Economic Success. Next to her, and close to me, Erica McConduit Diggs, who's the president, chief executive officer of the Urban League of Greater New Orleans. So, extended family here in the city, and a Howard graduate. So, absolutely, got a big up, right? Next to me is Brother Jose Luis Santos, who is the vice president for higher education policy at the Ed Trust, Education Trust. I'm sorry, Ed Trust, because it's been around so long. It's a well-known brand, so glad to have you here. And finally, next to Jose is Mildred Ortero, who is the Chief Education Counsel for the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Read much of Senator Harkin's bill. I guess 800 pages is a lot to read.
780.
Okay. Lamar Alexander, by the way, was governor of Tennessee when I was an undergrad, and he had some very interesting ideas on higher ed that I guess he's bringing to bear on the panel. With that in mind, we have to be reminded that although we're being broadcast and we're being taped and we're going to use this as an education resource for Mildred, we have to be a little careful because this thing is in flux. So what you can be talking about a little bit, some of it will be off the record. So
completely off the record.
Completely off the record. So let's all just use the information, but consider the source and respect that process.
No tweeting, blogging. I just want to make sure we're very specific for folks so that.
Thank you very much for explaining exactly what that means.
So,
yeah, I know that's right. We need you on that hill, so absolutely. So let's start. Marcy, I was reviewing the Urban League's the report and the executive summary in particular, and they talk about the fact that the majority of students that we're talking about, the targeted students, particularly African American college undergraduates, are what they call non-traditional students, 65%. That's interesting. They often work. For some undergraduates, working and going to school is not unusual, but for this population, the majority have some combination of that, right? And they find it hard to often close that economic gap. Financial aid isn't enough, and there are gaps there. Your research, what could you help us understand about the ways in which student aid programs favor traditional students and kind of leave non-traditional students out in the cold? Is there anything that you find in your scholarship that helps us understand where those gaps are and what we might do to help close them?
Sure. So to unpack what non-traditional means just a little bit is it can be described by a variety of ways, but I think the way we mostly describe it is students who are working, students who are older, students who maybe are 24 or older who go back to school later in life, students who are parents, students who are first generation, and then a number of other dimensions. But I think those sort of 5 elements are what we typically think of as non-traditional students. So not the 18-year-old transitioning directly from high school to college. And so as the report mentions, a majority of African American students are non-traditional by one of these elements or multiple elements. And of course that's where we get into some issues and greater challenges in terms of completion. But in terms of the actual financial aid program, which is your immediate question, how do the financial aid programs favor traditional students over non-traditional students, or more appropriately, I think, how is the financial aid system sort of just not designed for the needs of non-traditional students? I could talk about it in two different ways. So the first way is sort of hard P, capital P policy, which is that the student aid formula is actually not designed to meet the needs of independent non-traditional students. There are a number of ways, but I'm going to list 6. First, the loss of the summer Pell program. So previously, students could get a Pell Grant in the summer term, and that aided students who needed to go part-time over a number of semesters, take summer classes, and actually get financial aid for that rather than paying it out of their pocket or having to take out student loans to take summer courses if they ran out of Pell during the year. Another way is the loss of the ability to benefit provision. There's a provision in the student financial aid law, that allowed students without a high school diploma or equivalency to access financial aid if they could prove their ability to benefit from post-secondary education. This includes a lot of non-traditional students who don't want to go through that sequential approach to getting their education. There are a lot of experiences, rich experiences that come from work and life that non-traditional students have that may not be categorized in a GED. And so enabling students to access post-secondary education without having to get their GED first helped a lot of, created access for a number of minority and non-traditional students. Also, the reliance on the credit hour, then focusing on reliance on the credit hour versus competency-based models, and that's incredibly wonky. But the idea is, again, that there are a lot of rich work and life experiences that one can gain outside of the educational classroom. And so if you think about college on awarding competencies and based on your skills and awarding degrees based on skills, rather than sitting in a seat for 3 hours a week, that could be a better way to award financial aid. We need to think about how to integrate that delivery model with awarding of financial aid. Another way is the work penalty. I think one of the panelists mentioned this, that if you work, it's actually you're penalized and you actually have to give more of that income to the financial to your estimated contribution, and then you get less financial aid. Obviously, students who work should contribute something. We all understand that people need to contribute something to their education, but the levels at which that are set creates a penalty for a lot of non-traditional students. There's also one of the things that's most important is that education, post-secondary education, isn't aligned with other supportive services that might help students. So things like the TANF program, things like the food stamp program, things like childcare subsidies, a lot of the rules and regulations at the state and the federal levels aren't aligned to help students who are in college access a robust set of supportive services as well as financial aid in college programs. The second thing, I'll be really quick, is that institutions themselves are not always designed to meet the needs of students. So again, the panelists were talking about that HBCUs that they had attended had a really terrific, robust set of services. And that is great, but it is not the norm. Not for HBCUs necessarily, but for colleges nationally. The aid is often awarded on a first-come, first-served basis, which I understand, again, there are reasons for that. But a lot of non-traditional students decide later in that academic term that they want to go back to school, or a immediate job loss might necessitate going back to school and making that decision in July rather than in the August before you apply to school, before you may be enrolled. So you may not have a year to think about it. There's also very limited on-campus childcare. This hits minority students extremely hard because 47% of African American students are parents when they go back to school, and this is the undergraduate students. But less than one half of community colleges actually have on-campus childcare. So the costs of childcare alone could create significant pressures for students to be able to not complete. And then lastly, that institutions and financial aid administrators, it's not their job to be public benefit cheerleaders or champions. They don't know all of the rules, the state laws and the federal laws around access to public benefits. And it creates a system where students have to navigate multiple systems themselves, and that's often just too challenging. And it limits access to public benefits for a lot of college students.
Wow, that's quite
a lot.
List of barriers, right? I just kept thinking about W.B. Du Bois. Is a book that was published called The Education of Black People. These are commencement addresses he gave at black colleges. And as you went through each of those barriers, everything that he talked about as early as 1906 at Hampton just continued to resonate, and it just reinforces in some ways the idea that these structures were not designed for folks to succeed. In fact, they were designed to exclude in many ways. So what you're doing is counterintuitive. What everybody's work is doing is counterintuitive. Thank you, and we'll come back around and have that conversation. Erica, you, in leading the New Orleans affiliate of the National Urban League, like several other affiliates around the country, y'all had some success in terms of creating college readiness programs, bridge programs, particularly as they help students transition to that first year of school. Pleased to learn that you've been working not only in terms of New Orleans generally, but also focusing on some universities. You mentioned Dillard when we were talking.
Yes.
What kind of successes have you all been able to accomplish, and how can you help us understand where students, their parents, and others in the community might go to identify some of those resources?
Sure. You know, it's an interesting question because I approach this work from a very personal and professional level. I was a non-traditional student. And so when I went back to get my law degree, I had a 2-year-old. And so when you mentioned childcare, so when you mentioned childcare, I mean, obviously I can immediately connect to that. Knowing the students that we serve through our Project Ready program, and also serving in my role as an adjunct professor at Dillard, I see all of the challenges, and it's really overwhelming. It's, you know, anything from housing. You know, we get calls from students, well, I don't have a dorm room. I thought I did, and I don't. Family obligations, right? I have to go back home and help my mom care for my siblings. You know, money, financial aid. I don't have enough. You know, even at Dillard University, which is an HBCU, something like just over $1,000 gap could mean the difference in that student being able to actually participate. And so as we designed our program that we implement at our affiliate, we try to speak to all of those things to say, how can we make it as seamless as possible for our young people to not have to go into college with so many barriers. And so we have transitioned our model, quite frankly, over the years. Initially, we only focused on 4-year institutions, and we said we're going to really recruit not the top tier students in high school. We're going to go to the next tier, those that, you know, if we provide the supports that we know they need, they can achieve. Tutoring, mentorship, experiential learning opportunities, college tours, ACT preparatory. But what we learned is even with all of those things, that was still not enough. We ended up having to hire positions like social workers, right? Because our students were coming in with a host of challenges that, quite frankly, academically focused individuals were not equipped to manage with these students. Mental health challenges. We're in New Orleans, you know, so we have a population of students that are dealing with quite a bit. People think Hurricane Katrina is 9 years past. It's still very, very ripe for some families. And so you have to walk through that with our students and our families. So we had to hire social workers. We had to hire a director of college success, a position specifically focused on supporting our seniors as they graduated and throughout their first year of college. So that was all that position focused on, was for our first cohort of seniors that went on to college, having a person, a point person that they could all come back to, and they did. They utilized our staff member immensely to say, look, all of the things that I laid out, I'm having challenges, I need help. Things fell through the cracks. And so while we thought we had it figured out, we constantly had to course correct to really try to modify our model to try to eliminate as many barriers as possible. The other thing that I'd say is that, you know, as our program has evolved, we realized that still we weren't serving all the needs of all of our students. And in New Orleans, we have to have a more expansive view of what success looks like for our students. And so we ended up figuring that just purely focusing on a 4-year institution was in some ways leaving out a number of our students and not allowing them to achieve maximum success for them. in our region, in the Gulf Coast region, 2-year degrees could get you very profitable jobs and careers. And we never really talked about that with our students as an avenue that they should explore. It was first generation students. We wanted them to go to 4-year institutions, but we found ourselves allowing some to fall through the gaps, because when we pushed them to a 4-year institution and they failed, we had to then help pipeline them into a 2-year university to essentially keep them on a college-going path. And so we've continued to course correct and modify, but honestly, you have to come in, I know Chanel mentioned this term earlier, with social safety nets. And I actually appreciate that term, because our students need so much more than just the traditional safety net.
I'm just thinking about in terms of bringing these things to scale, the best practices that you mentioned, and this constant course correct. That's very interesting. I mean, you can't take you off the ball and just making those kind of corrections. You know, it's interesting, many people may have seen in the New York Times, I guess it was May, one of the May weeks, the cover story on the University of Texas and the wraparound supports they were trying to create down there. And I just kind of chuckled to myself. I'm like, wow, okay, in the wake of Fisher, and this idea that you can retain students by creating some type of support network that heretofore hadn't existed. Jose, y'all have done a lot of work at Trust, you know, not just dealing with the economic dimension, but everything else that comes along with success. And one of the things that we see that while cost is significant, in this report, in fact, the Urban League report identifies these, the fact that financial aid alone isn't enough. And we've heard it now. You know, we know that it's not enough. With that in mind, Ed Trust has been working on a national level to help publicize this question and do research on public colleges and universities and how they boost college completion strategies for low-income and underserved students. I know one of the things that we see, and it's interesting, you say that from the 4-year to the 2-year, maybe making that adjustment. A lot of these little schools, when I was at Temple and other places, you see black students come in the door, you see the financial aid money still coming in, you see the feds still saying you have diversity, but you don't see those same students graduating, but the percentage of black students remains the same. They let them in, but they somehow don't make it out. What is Ed Trust identified as maybe some solutions to some of those problems, and how are you all thinking about this question of completion rates?
Right, so that's an excellent question. So the way Ed Trust looks at this question of completion is trying to identify best practices. So this was a great example in terms of institutions taking an active role. So I remember from the earlier panel, students were kind of in some ways owning student responsibility and responsibilities of families, and that's an important part of getting to college and succeeding in college. But at Ed Trust, we're trying to really focus squarely on the institutions and what the institutions can do, and really trying to shift somewhat of that onus onto the institutions and their responsibility in this partnership with students of color, low-income students, and their families. So there are a couple of different examples that we've identified, and I'll just focus on one, and that's Florida State University. And the idea here is, I'll talk some basic specifics about that program, but really want to extrapolate that to other institutions in terms of what it really takes. And it's this notion of trying to coordinate different offices at a university. So we're talking about enrollment management, we're talking about registrar, we're talking about outreach. So trying to really coordinate these different centers at a university for the purpose of college access, retention, and of course outcomes. A lot of colleges and universities across the country have actually done coordination around enrollment management. The difference here, though, is that they've coordinated these offices under a banner of enrollment management for the purpose of being much more selective and going after top tier, top flight types of students. So this is one example. Florida State is one example, as we hail as an example, who put a center together that really looked at this whole notion of access, retention, and engagement with these students. So the other part of this dimension is for institutions to proactively identify with the data that they have. They have unit level student record, so they know who the student is from matriculation to completion. So they can identify at any point in that pathway in college when a student, or any students for that matter, are somehow not meeting a particular milestone, a gateway class, or something that has predictive validity to say something about their ability to retain to persist onto next year or succeed in the very class that they're in. So we have mechanisms in place at institutions. Institutions have the data, they're very equipped with it. Now, lower resource institutions obviously have some challenges with that. Well, this is where EdTrust and other partners can play a role in really kind of pushing this notion of accountability with these institutions, but also advocating for greater support, help, technical assistance, what have you, for these lower resource institutions that educate the bulk of lower income and students of color. So that's kind of one example, and then kind of framing it in the broader national scale.
No, thank you. I mean,
Yep.
it's interesting as you talk, Jose. I'm thinking about even at Howard, our enrollment management strategy, and so much of that resonates in terms of attempting to synchronize those things. But then the creaming dimension of the four-year colleges, to expand, it's very, 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 it's very much a challenge. Because I find even at historically black schools, there's this notion of trying to bring in these quote-unquote top students. And one of the things in preparation for this panel that I did was talk to the Howard students in my classes the past week, and they keep coming back to these questions. One of them is the question of literacy, student preparation. And, you know, interesting, in the previous panel, the students did own a lot of responsibility for preparing themselves, but then what happens when you're prepared and you fall through the cracks a bit? Mildred, you know, it's interesting with Senator Harkin, Senator Alexander, this bill is heating up now. I think the comment period just closed, and so we're going now to talk about the Higher Education Affordability Act. And in that process, many of the barriers that have been discussed today in the previous panel and today, these are things that the center certainly has, and the staff and you all have put into this bill, and now trying to see it forth and get the president's signature and move forward. Urban League certainly believes that there are reforms in the chairman's bill which will help increase college access, affordability, so forth and so on, as it relates to being able to successfully matriculate. What will happen to the fate of the chairman's bill, given the fact that he's retiring after this year, and we're all holding our breath over the arc of the next month? This is from students, in addition to the Urban League generating some questions. These are real questions that some of my students had. They said, let's pose it to you, and they're not tweeting or doing anything like that. This is a serious thing. How do you anticipate?
So, I mean, I think that one of the reasons why it was really important for us to release the draft as a discussion is that it's not just about Senator Harkin. This is about the Democratic side of the committee and what ideas, really a lot of the ideas were generated by members on and off of committee. But we also wanted to pose and give an opportunity to the higher ed community, really the K-12 community has been responding, everyone's been responding, to sort of give us their feedback on whether or not we're headed in the right direction. We've received comments from 120 organizations. So my staff has been very, very busy, really reading through, and I've actually have asked them to create a grid with every single comment from all 120 organizations, and we're literally going through them comment by comment. So it's going to take us a little bit to get through it, but I think that that's an important part of the conversation because it isn't just about Senator Harkin. The committee staff will remain, you know, with the next chairperson, and it's important for us to understand how everyone is weighing in. I want to respond a little bit to little things that everyone has said, just because so many of this is in our bill, and I want to be sure that I'm sort of capturing it. And I think I'll start with sort of the goals, and I think it was really important to us that we took a real thoughtful approach to the Higher Education Act. So in the last 3 years, we had an entire series just on college affordability. So we had a series of hearings that had nothing to do with sort of looking at the bill, but saying, let's tackle higher ed affordability issues, and what do we need to know? The biggest takeaway from that was state disinvestment. As states disinvested in their public higher ed system, the higher ed system responded by raising tuition, and parents and students took out more loans, and it became this very vicious cycle that no one really complained about because the higher ed lobby there's not a lot of college students really up in arms. And I think what's happened over the last 2 years with the big sort of debt boom is that college students are now up in arms and saying, why are we in so much debt? They're not buying homes, they're not making other life decisions because they're paying off student debt. And so the student debt crisis, I think, has brought college affordability to the forefront, and that's, I think, a very positive thing that's allowed us to do that. And then at the beginning of this Congress, we then started a higher ed reauthorization series of hearings. We did 13 hearings overall. on a gamut of issues from accreditation, accountability, affordability, you name it. We sort of looked at it. We did a hearing on HBCUs, a hearing on TRIO programs. I mean, we really tried to sort of be very thoughtful about looking at every aspect of the higher ed system before releasing a draft. And so what you see is not just Senator Harkin, it is Senator Harkin with absolutely most of the Democratic side of the aisle represented, I think, and I would say some members off of committee. We have a lot of provisions there that are important to Senator Booker, who's off of committee, other members who kind of came to us and said, it's really important that if you're going to release something, that it have this, because it's important to constituents in my state and so forth. And so we have some of that. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight, just because I think one of the things that, if anyone has been following Senator Harkin's work on the HELP committee prior to the college affordability conversation, he had a 2-year investigation of the for-profit industry, which really, I think, it's my bias, but you know, I will concede that. That's our biggest challenge in many ways, because we lose so many students of color and low-income students of color to for-profit schools that promise them a big dream and then don't deliver. And so they didn't come to existence on their own. They came to existence because traditional higher ed, you know, and I sort of responding to your first comments, like they didn't set up their systems for non-traditional students. So there aren't classes on the weekends and in the evenings and in times when students can go, and then you have commercials that are like, you can get your degree in your pajamas, right? And so if I'm a student and I'm trying to get back into the workforce, or I'm just an adult trying to get back into the workforce, that's a lot more appealing than going to my local community college or 4-year or whatever and trying to figure out registration, you know, applying, and then, okay, this class is only at 10 a.m., 3 days a week, you know, it's not a welcoming environment for an adult or a non-traditional student coming back into the higher ed system. So part of that investigation for him was looking at, you know, where were a lot of the financial aid dollars going. He's an appropriator. He thought about this from a money perspective. For-profit schools represent 10% of students. 10% of the college, the higher ed world is for-profits. They represent 25% of our financial aid dollars, federal dollars that go into the higher ed system. 25% of them are taken by a higher ed sector that only represents 10% of our students, and they represent 50% of our defaults. So 50% of the default rates in our higher ed system right now, that means students that cannot pay back their loans, are students that went to a for-profit school. And so I highlight that because I think that in this bill you'll find huge things that support HBCUs, a lot of support for, you know, a lot of institutions that are trying to get more African American students to achieve, but we also have to understand that there are some bad apples that we need to sort of regulate and have some accountability around them, because they're hurting our kids. And so I want to I would be remiss if I didn't make that connection. And part of it, I think, is a little bit of what you were talking about, that at Dillard you had to hire social workers, and you know, there are students that come to the higher system with very special needs. So when you have an institution that is not making those investments, you're not going to get those outcomes. And so, you know, it's hard to do a lot of things virtually. I think students are more successful in a grad program virtually because they've already have the understanding of what it takes to be successful in a college setting. Most of these programs target 2-year degrees with students that have never ever gone to an institution of higher education. So they don't have the sort of fundamental base of what it takes to be successful. And so, you know, I'm throwing out a lot. But I think the last thing that I wanted to also talk about is one of the provisions in our bill is a grant program that highlights a little bit of something that was mentioned earlier, and that is students that went to a 4-year college, dropped out with enough credits to have an associate's degree, but weren't able to actually get one at that 4-year institution. So we create a grant program that allows a 4-year institution to partner with a community college in their area and go and actually find those students, say, hi, you have this many credits. I know you didn't graduate from this 4-year institution, but we can accredit you a 2-year degree from this community college. And that was our way of saying, you know, those credits matter. Those students worked hard. Those are 2 years that they gave and that they probably borrowed money and are trying to pay back. Let's at least get them an associate's degree that could get them a different kind of job. And so that's one of the things that's also in the bill, and I want to make sure I don't talk too much.
No, not at all. In fact, this is, I mean, I think we've kind of opened up, and now that the major substantive points are out there, I think maybe folks talking to each other can kind of emerge. You know, as we were talking and as I was listening and taking notes here, Marcy, that I did 2 years in Philadelphia as an administrator for School District Philadelphia, and well, one of the things we did was make a mandatory African American history course. I helped write that curriculum, so we'll see if that does any benefit. But Marcy, you mentioned the infamous Carnegie unit. I mean, you know, time in seat. Does this transcript, you know, correlate to academic achievement and graduation standards? And we were trying to get away from that and talking about what students know, what they're able to do, that kind of common conversation. But Mildred, you raised, just in these remarks, where the rubber meets the road when it comes to policy and shifting policy. How much of this is about connecting those best practices that Jose mentioned? Certainly that, Erica, that you have, you know, begun to not only identify but connect and then demonstrate and illustrate. How much of this is about fine-tuning the extant? Pell Grants, for example, I know some of my students over the last week have said, for example, they didn't realize they were eligible for so much money. So maybe like little policy shifts, like, you know, being able to have gateway kind of things. So Jose, like saying that enrollment management unit or whatever's going on, do you have a gateway threshold information kind of thing so students can do FAFSA in the right way? Her brother is eligible for more than she was because they went in wrong or differently. How much of it is tinkering around the edges with that, and not just tinkering, but making those policy shifts? And how much of this is structural? Are we talking about education reform when we're talking about a system that was never meant to educate everybody? The chair of the English department at Howard, for example, is from a little town in northern Louisiana, Tallulah, Louisiana. And if you got an associate's degree, you can get a job in Shreveport. You can work on, I mean, but it won't happen unless people know. And then, but then how much of this is larger forces, like the socioeconomic forces, the forces that might be making money off these for-profit jobs that are like, we don't want this to change because we have an economic stake. I mean, how much of this is structural, and how much of this is just making these policy adjustments that add up to some change?
Well, I'll take a stab and say that, you know, honestly, for us in Louisiana, our economy is driving a different conversation. And so it's a matter of demand that's pushing on the education system. We have, I'm sure many of you guys have heard, probably one of the most aggressive education reform efforts underway in our K-12. Our K-12, the higher ed budget is continuing to be cut in Louisiana.
Even K-12, you're saying.
But K-12 is currently undergoing an aggressive reform, but that's also being pushed down from the business sector. And that's where, you know, it is important for organizations like the Urban League to continue to play a role and help stand in the gap. We do workforce development. We do economic development through our entrepreneurship centers. We also have education programs. And so how do you start marrying the two? When our companies in the Gulf Coast region are saying, we have jobs, we don't have workers, we don't have people to fill these jobs, and it is incumbent upon you, education system, to essentially deliver qualified, skilled employees for us. I mean, honestly, the Gulf Coast region is one of the high growth regions in the country. We're still developing jobs. We just don't have the talent pipeline yet to fill all the need. And so it's pushing on the the community college system to step up and say we need to have a workforce development conversation. We need to talk about dual enrollment. Louisiana traditionally had not focused heavily on making sure that our high school students graduated with college credits. Unless you were in AP courses or something else, we didn't really have a larger conversation about dual enrollment. Well, now the state has adopted Jumpstart initiative, and that is really Louisiana's effort to start talking about technical education. Our high schools really at this point are still trying to figure out, most of them, what to do with this. They don't have the articulation agreements already laid out between the 2-year, the 4-year institutions, the high school setting, and so we're working through that. But as an Urban League, through our Project Ready program, we're working in the high schools to say, listen, this is how you will pay for it, because that's the biggest question. Well, how can we pay for this? We hear that we have to dual enroll our students, but we have only so much MFP dollars to go around, and they're dedicated already. So how do we afford to then dual enroll them in our community college system? So Our funding, our state funding, per pupil funding allocation in Louisiana. I shouldn't use acronyms, I'm sorry.
No, that's important.
It's a minimum
because I know
foundation
people around the country be
program.
watching this. Yeah.
MFP actually stands for the minimum foundation program, and that is our per pupil allocation for the K-12 system. But
Do they pay
so
regular
those,
tuition rates at the school?
well, so yeah, that's figuring out how do we leverage additional grant dollars to pay for beyond the MFP, beyond our per pupil allocation, how do we stretch and leverage to provide greater opportunities for our students to dual enroll. And so having us help work through that process to really talk about these are the demand sectors. These are the job opportunities. So let's not continue to pipeline students into fields that there's no jobs. And so how do we start having a larger, expansive conversation about not just education and not just workforce development, but how the two marry together. And so for us, it is really a demand conversation that's pushing on all the other systems to start aligning themselves.
Is that something, Marcy or Jose, perhaps, is that something that is more economically viable, this dual enrollment conduit, so that perhaps some of the financial burden is borne K-12? Well, I guess it would be, what, 11th, 12th grade? When can they start taking classes?
So 11th and 12th grade is
Okay,
where we
yeah.
really start pushing them to dual enroll. But we start having conversations in 9th grade, because that's
No,
the thing. We have to have
No.
early conversations and
Absolutely.
early exposure.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, so is that more than just a small adjustment? Is that something that we might see even at the state level, other states looking at in terms of best practices that could help? Or where do you place dual enrollment in? Oh, please, no, go ahead.
I was going to jump in to
No,
say
no,
that
no, absolutely.
we actually do have a grant program in the Higher Education Affordability Act for dual enrollment. And I think something to really understand is that dual enrollment is something that has existed in a lot of high-income neighborhoods for a really long time. It's about creating equity and making sure that kids in low-income communities and in Title I schools also have access to dual enrollment programs. And it actually really hits on the affordability issue as well, because if you can graduate from high school with college credits already under your belt, you walk in as a sophomore in a lot of cases, and that, decreases the amount of time.
Or halfway to a 2-year degree.
Or halfway to a 2-year
And then
degree,
that would
and
really-
that decreases
wow.
the amount of loans that you're gonna have to take out.
No
And so for
question.
us, it was really important that we had a grant program in, because a lot of times there are high schools that actually charge students a fee to be in a dual enrollment program or have them pay a certain portion of the tuition, and that's not something we think we should happen at the high school level. We think those programs should be free, because the entire point of them is to give kids a head start in getting their college credits.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I would add to the point that dual enrollment programs have existed in high schools for a long time, but they're just starting to emerge in GED and adult education programs. A tremendous number of students of color are in GED preparation programs or in adult education programs or working towards that. And if we think that high school students do that, why don't we think that adults can do that too? And so I just think dual enrollment should be sort of more broadly defined and encouraged as well.
Yeah.
So we've a couple of things have kind of popped up in the conversation. So there's the issue of demand. So workforce demand issues driving a lot of this conversation, and that's true. And so then there's the issue of the value of the 4-year degree and how we finance that and who's financing it. So let me just speak to a couple of those points. So the workforce demand issues, I actually agree how you're framing the conversation. It's really not this or the other, but really we're at a place where we need to be having a conversation about those two working together depending on the needs of, well, if we talk about it at the state level, the state, so people at the state level care about it at the state level, right? The national level, we're looking at broader issues. We're looking at the whole country and policies that help inform that. So the issue of workforce demands, there are not all associate degrees or 2-year degrees are created equal, right? So we know the research is very clear that there are some jobs out there with a 2-year degree or some kind of certification. You can get radiologists, for example. You can get paid very well, have a great quality of life, and raise a family on a degree like that, right? So the issue, though, is kind of what the students in the previous panel were talking about. It's kind of the information part of it, right? Coming from communities, low-income communities, oftentimes that information doesn't really trickle down in a way that really helps young people make life choices. So that if there are jobs out there, typically they don't know what those jobs are. And so the counseling part of it is a whole nother dimension of where we woefully lag in high schools to be able to inform young people what kind of life choices they can be thinking of, right? That could help make decisions. If they're not going to do the 4-year degree, that's not their interest, Well, there are 2-year degrees waiting for them that may put them in a situation where they can have a great career, right? And also meets the needs of the state, right? So that's that issue. Now, on the 4-year side of things, it's also this kind of notion of social and cultural capital, right? Where young people get their information from and how that informs their decision making 2-year or 4-year. Then there's the bigger issue of financing it, right? So there are a lot of questions with respect to how a young person finances his or her education. So we're very much interested at the Ed Trust about looking at this question from the standpoint of, well, there's quite a bit of money floating out there, right? $180 billion in federal aid, and so we raise questions around how this money gets distributed, who uses that money.
What have you found?
Well,
Especially in the case where somebody owes $1,000, which is not a lot of money, but all the money in the world is somebody without any money. What have you found about where this money finds?
well, so that leads us into a whole nother conversation, right, in terms of how the money is.
We're coming to everybody
Yeah.
in about 2-3 minutes. As soon as they finish, we're going to open this up. Take advantage, please, because these folks can answer some of these questions.
Well, I'll keep it very brief. I mean, the money issue is that there's a lot of money from the federal government that flows to colleges, universities through tax credits. There's money that flows directly to students that leverage and cash in directly at the universities, institutions themselves. Well, we believe, just as I indicated here earlier about not all degrees are created equal, well, not all institutions are created equal either. Some institutions serve a lot more of the students of color that we care about, low-income students, and a lot of them typically can be under-resourced. Well, we find some are doing a better job at it than others. Then we find other institutions that aren't serving students of color and low-income students at all. Well, not at all, but are serving less and less of them. And this has a lot to do with financial demands placed upon them, state resources shrinking relative to their expenditures, their costs, and so forth and so on. So because that exists, then we believe it's time for some greater accountability for these institutions, right?
Like a report card?
Well, not necessarily a report card.
That was a curveball question.
We actually initiated a report. It's called Tough Love. And I love the title because it's time for that tough love, to administer that tough love to our institutions. And I think we should highlight, as we talked about earlier with the best practices, highlight those institutions that are doing a good job, that are being very proactive with their student populations. But at the same time, I think we have a responsibility, and I think the federal government has a responsibility to call to account those institutions that have sizable percentages of students of color, low-income students, and to really call into question, what are these institutions doing? How are they servicing these particular students? And if they're not doing a good job at it, then we shouldn't run away from that. We should call it into question. We should also scaffold the supports, technical assistance, help, to see if we can help improve those results. And I'm talking about having more Pell eligible students, not having less, but having more, and try to put some minimal standards, minimal thresholds for that. Looking at graduation rates, looking at default rates. There's a whole host of metrics that we can actually look at. That's just, in a very brief way, the conversation we could be having, and we can reframe it to the accountability piece as well through policy.
That's good. Thank you. I mean, we're going to open it up because we could be talking the rest of the night. I mean, I think there was a consensus, well, it seemed like an emerging consensus around the value of people in real time working together in terms of educational institutions. The for-profits, that's a huge piece of it. I mean, maybe they shouldn't get any more money, but but at any rate, I mean, there are any number of possibilities. Let's open it up. I know some folks. Absolutely, please, please let everybody know who you are and let us know.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keisha Lee, and I work here in DC for a nonprofit leading global strategies. But my passion is really around historical Black colleges and minority-serving institutions. I'm an alum of Dillard. I really like your point, Dr. Santos, about really thinking through the risk that particularly MSIs take on when assuming a greater proportion of students who are from low-income backgrounds, under-resourced communities. My question, twofold. So A, is really about the college rating system, for example, and what types of precautions are going into place to take that into consideration, such that we just don't look at it from a deficit perspective, not just those institutions that aren't doing a great job of, uplifting that community, but the institutions that are doing an awesome job and learning from them. MSIs and HBCUs are often lumped into the same category, such that we don't pull the best practices, the teaching methods, all the centuries of history that has gone into really serving that population. Very concerned about the rating system and the inequities that are built into it, and just the lack of really culling data across state, local levels, and the institutional level, such that we can be robust in our decision making. My other point is really about college in general and the model. So we're here steeped in DC, policy wonks, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really hear a lot of conversation and talk about the actual model of higher education. Is it realistic for, and I'll pick on my institution, which I love dearly, but is it realistic for a historically black institution or a minority serving institution where typically 50% of the students are on Pell Grants to have a tuition that's $20,000, $30,000, $40,000? So at what point do we then start to have really we have these conversations around business models, really thinking through what does higher education look like, and especially within our minority serving institutions and HBCUs, and how do we start to develop a new age agenda around what college can be, such that we serve our communities in the most robust way, and we aren't leaving school in massive debt, right? So $40,000 a year for a college education, and nobody in my family makes $40,000 a year. No one has that salary. So there's a lot of absurdness there that I think we just kind of cull over and we don't have a conversation about. I'd love to get the panel's thoughts on it.
Thank you, Keith. Anybody want to take that lead on?
Well, I'll start with the first piece. I think you raised the issue of the ratings, the rating system. I think that's fresh in people's minds, and certainly the ratings have been critiqued on a number of fronts. Let me just say, with respect to, I'm not going to be the next person that critiques it, but I will say that, yeah, I think we certainly need to be careful with respect to what those ratings actually do and how they might inadvertently create a situation where schools that enroll students that are largely place bound, geographically bound. So by definition, by geographic location, they are going to enroll a lion's share of students of color, low-income students. So to then kind of call them to account because they're not performing in a particular way, or because a large, sizable portion of their enrollments are from these populations, maybe not so fair. However, back to the issue that I raised, and we raised it at Trust, that we think we need to be firm with these institutions just as well. We can't give institutions a free pass, especially because a lot of our kids from our communities are enrolling in these institutions. So we still need to hold them to account. So I think this is why it's incumbent upon the federal government and any rating system that it would give these institutions kind of a fair timeline to kind of assess their performance goals with graduation rates, persistence rates, access. We would go as far as saying that. And so have them build and ramp up to these desirable goals. So that's the first part. And the second part I can kind of open up to my colleagues here.
Do you mind if I just,
Please.
I'll just jump into that, because I think you won't, the rating system is not in our reauthorization bill. We did not put language in our bill connected to that, and I think partly because I think we're waiting to see what the department is doing and what factors they're looking into. They did a very robust sort of, I think, town halls around the country and getting input, and we want to kind of see the results of that first. But I think that I also caution everyone that the reaction that higher ed has had to that rating system has also been surprising. We actually didn't have it in our bill, and we got tons of comments about it, telling us not to make sure not to put it in our bill, which is interesting. But yet, as a country, we're comfortable with U.S. News and World Reports doing a ranking every year of colleges and universities based on measures that generally I don't care about. And that rating system has driven policies around the country and how higher education institutions behave. And so if you think about the fact that we, again, traditional higher ed, and I don't want to sort of just beat up on them, spend a lot of money on buildings and brick and mortar and the new stadium and the new football fields, and make sure that we have a food court that has KFC and McDonald's. And when they do the tours, that's what they sell to parents and students. Like, come here, you get free Wi-Fi, and it's got Starbucks, and that is the experience. And so they're selling parents and students on the experience of higher ed based on these factors. That is what U.S. News and World Report looks at when they rank them. And so I think it's, you know, and I don't want to make it sound like it's that simple. They take other factors into account, but they're not factoring in how many low-income kids, Pell students they're graduating. They're not factoring in, you know, what is their graduation rate overall. Some of our colleges have an 11% graduation rate. That should be a sin. I mean, that is just, it just appalls me. But we don't talk about that. We don't have an honest conversation about it. And so I don't want to say that I'm endorsing it, the rating system, because again, I haven't seen all the factors that go into it, but I'm also just questioning the visceral reaction to it, given that the only other thing parents have to go on is another rating system that takes into account things that aren't as important to our community. So.
Well, and I think the distinction that I would draw there is that no one disagrees that we need a lot more information for the sake of consumer transparency, but I think we would draw a distinction between information used for the sake of transparency versus accountability. And I think that we have a long way to go, just like you said, on the use of data for transparency. And I think another person on the panel mentioned something, on the previous panel, mentioned something about not having the data on students like them. And that's, I think, a real concrete step that we can take about showing students data about outcomes, graduation earnings by program of study, so not mushing together arts majors and engineering majors, but for students disaggregating data by student characteristics so that students know going into it what students like them have come out with. I think that would be a great next step, we short of a rating system.
Tons of new data points in our bill that I think we're getting beat up about for doing that, but I think I will say that the 2008 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act put a lot of new criterias on data points and things that we wanted to be able to get out to the public that have somehow gotten mishmashed, and it's become this, now all I hear from a lot of institutions is the reporting burden. There's a reporting burden on them to report so much, and I think it's really figuring out what is the right information, how do we give it to parents and students in a way that they understand and can make decisions on it. And I don't know that our draft did it right, I don't know that we did it right in 2008, but I think we have to constantly kind of come back and have this conversation and get feedback from students about what it is that they actually, what drives their decision making. Because a lot of times we talk to students on the back end, the graduates, and say, what would have helped you? But we're not talking to like high school students and saying, what will help you as you're making your decision for college? What information do you need? And I don't know that we're doing that.
I would just want to transition to the second portion of
Yes,
her.
because I think thank you. That's the first time I think we heard teaching as a teacher. That might be the difference maker in a lot of ways in terms of some of these institutions.
But I think your question about the affordability of HBCUs is really a critical one, because I think we can all acknowledge and agree that there's something incredibly special about an HBCU, right? Having been a graduate of an HBCU, there's something incredibly special about attending, matriculating, and graduating from an HBCU. HBCUs still have to remain competitive, and I think that that's the rub for them, is that how do you continue to keep that something special that people want and seek out HBCUs for, while also being competitive with all those who are building Starbucks and two-lane football stadiums inside. And so it becomes a challenge, but I think the core of your question is probably more of the solution, and that is how does the college sector, particularly HBCUs, reinvent themselves to be more responsive? And I would say that really looking at your for-profits, perhaps, and seeing what's driving that bottom line for them, and giving them the competitive dollar edge, and try to incorporate some of those things, right? Be it the more online classes, the ability to do things at your own time, at your own pace. I think those are creative solutions, but it's always going to be a challenge to overlay that and maintaining that something special that you get from actually physically attending an HBCU.
That's a difficult challenge.
Can I,
No, please, absolutely, and then we'll get somebody. Oh, everybody's all right.
I grew up in a low-income neighborhood, I'll just say
That's
that.
right, which means
No,
you don't do a straight
I
at the
flinched.
gunshot.
I flinched.
Please, go ahead.
So, is it me?
Yeah, no.
Oh. So a couple of things on the, so that second part of the question also was about, kind of getting back to the basics. What I detected almost, what I draw from it is this notion of the public good and how do we get back to this notion of the role of higher education, what it's designed for, what the federal government had in mind when it put together the, the kind of need-based funding, federal financial aid programs. And I think that's the right question to ask. So this issue of colleges having to compete, that's exactly right. But we'd have to kind of peel back the onion layer a little bit here with respect to why they're feeling like they have to compete. And this again is not a free pass for institutions. It's just to kind of partially explain why they're behaving the way that they're behaving. But we need someone else to regulate the behavior. And this is kind of what I want to get at. So universities are, colleges and universities, whatever the type they are, they're just doing what they would want to do in an environment where resources are becoming more scarce, and they're having to figure out how to redistribute those resources. And the other part of this component is competition is an incredible thing. So what ends up happening is if you're competing for students, you're also trying to attract those students. And when you're trying to attract students, you're trying to build things. So Starbucks, I'd argue, is not just because the university wants to build a Starbucks.
Right.
There's a demand side to that component, and that means somebody's demanding a Starbucks. So if you've been in colleges and universities lately, there's also these kind of Barnes & Noble feel to your bookstore.
That's Barnes & Noble field.
Right. Okay. So somebody's demanding this stuff, right? It's not just the beautiful lawns and the. So there's a demand side to this. Is what I really want to get at. So what's the point of all this? And I'll keep it brief. Colleges, universities, and this is Economics 101, left to their own devices in this seemingly competitive market, are going to do what they think is best for their universities to survive. Period. Right. So if we leave them to their own devices, this is what they will do. So we'd argue that, well, we can't do that. The cost is too big, right? And we start talking about our communities of color, low-income students. The stakes are very, very high. And so we need someone to step in. So the federal government can step in, can leverage its resources that it's doling out to institutions through tax credits, direct funding, to the students, and so forth and so on, in a way to get the behavior that it would like, right? The other component to this is that universities reside in states. So we can't forget the value of the states. So I think you raised a lot of great points about the state and state legislature, state houses, and their role in partnership with colleges and universities and trying to meet the demands of their needs, whether it's economic or otherwise. So the public good piece, we need somebody to get it back to what higher education is really for, right? This whole notion of improving and sustaining a democracy that we value. I mean, all these great spillover effects that come out of higher education, right?
Thank you. Dean, yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this panel. My name is Reggie McGahee, and I'm the Dean of Admissions at Howard Law School. At the graduate and professional level, we see students that, of course, have gone to 4 years of undergrad and have gotten their degree. And you spoke earlier about the rating system and some obvious flaws there, but there seems to be also some adjustment that needs to be made in the way that education is presented. For example, we'll have students that will get a BA in political science, and they're from Georgia, where there's a flagship institution in Georgia that would cost them $4,000 a year to attend, yet they'll go to the University of Florida to get a BA in political science, where there's not really a distinction. There's no flagship program there, but then they'll incur $30,000 worth of debt extra than they would have needed to had they just been informed and attended their flagship institution in state, therefore relieve them of that undergraduate debt that would have made graduate and professional school a lot more feasible and possible for them. But it seems like that information isn't being provided to the student, it's not being trickled down to the students, so by the time that they get to me, they're like, I need resources to pay for rent. I'm about to cap out at the federal limit that I can borrow. So what messages can we kind of put together holistically so that students aren't just being told go to school and then end up going to any school that you want to attend, but go to the school that is more economically feasible so that you have more options down the road without the $100,000 worth of debt just so that you can say you attended a particular institution.
Thanks, question.
So at Ed Trust, we have the college results online, and that's one option for students, families, counselors, folks at the high schools and state to be able to compare similarly situated institutions that have similar demographics, compare them on a whole host of metrics, and see what the best value or who's doing better on graduating particular demographics. So that is one way that folks can compare and make those kinds of assessments. There are other tools out there, but we believe this is a really good tool because it really compares other peers, if you will. Not peers that institutions say they want to be compared to. Those would be aspirational peers. We say these are peers that are similar on a whole host of institutions, and then we look at them based on their performance, on graduation rate, their costs, and so forth and so on. So I'd encourage you to look at the college results online at the Ed Trust.
The other thing I'd say is when we work with our students, we work with the students and the families, and we have a conversation about best fit schools. So not just the, ivory tower type of schools, but really looking at that student's progression through high school, their aspirations, their own self-assessments. What is the best fit for you and your family? And so that's a shift in terms of how families typically just look at statistics, but really it's not just, while what's in the book and online is incredibly important, still how does this apply to you specifically? And so I think that's the conversation that certainly as a community organization, as the Urban League, we can have with families, that honest dialogue about what's the best fit university for you.
And at the policy level, too, a number of organizations have called for early awareness systems. So you're talking about the flaws of not having enough information about the options that are nearby. And if you had an early awareness system where you could potentially contact students as early as 8th grade whose families were eligible for public benefits, you could provide them from 8th grade on information about state options, state grant, need-based aid, available local post-secondary options, the benefits, the return of going to college, and you could even talk to them about what estimated Pell Grants they're likely to be eligible for if they have their current income. So there are also a number of sort of policy mechanisms, then these could be built into the Higher Education Reauthorization Act that could create systems that help states to reach out at the local level to those students.
Say that we do have an early awareness program in our bill as well.
Excellent. I just think about, I'm sure many of us in here have had the experience of the guidance counselor and, the league and its partners. I'm just thinking about the institution-based people who may not receive the support they need. Overworked guidance counselors in high schools, for example.
The young man say 500 students per counselor.
That's exactly
in the
right.
earlier panel. That's impossible.
Exactly right. What the dean was saying, you got a good guidance counselor. Hold on, sweetheart. That's the same major. You need to stay here. But if there's nobody in that building, or if they have to, they got a 30-second timer on the students, then yeah. I mean, so how much of this could be remedied if we just paid attention to the things that are already in place and strengthen them? Yes. Oh, please. Let's get some more. Somebody back there.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos McKnight. I am a high school senior here in Washington, D.C. I attend Thurgood Marshall Academy in Southeast Washington.
Yes.
And I do dual enrollment, which you guys were talking about earlier. I am a Achievers Scholarship recipient, and I love to learn. And my question is that, there's a lot of kids that I know in my school that are very privileged because our school does a lot with college, and that they make sure that their students are prepared for college. But on the other hand, there are also students who don't have the type of advantage that kids at my school do. And I want to know, how does your institutions, organizations, work with schools to, put a college counselor there, give out scholarship opportunities, have students come to events like this one that I was introduced to. How do you guys reach out to those schools to, find funding or find ways that students can, have the equal chances that I do to those who have, around the city and around the world and the country?
Thank you.
So as the Urban League program, we operate our Project Ready program in our affiliates throughout the country. You know, it's interesting, I spoke earlier about how our model has evolved, and the approach we are taking now is really going deep inside of schools, because we want to start shifting culture and within a school environment, and you have to have critical mass in order to do that. And so we have really embedded ourselves with our school partners so that we can have access to the high school teachers, the counselors, to have real conversation and communication about what are the needs, the unmet needs, and how we do a baton handoff, essentially. We teach courses in the school day. We have agreements with our school partners that we actually teach some elective periods during the school day, and we teach after school in our program. And so it's a unique model, but that for us has been through lessons learned in terms of how we best serve those students, to your point, who don't have the same access to opportunity that you have in your school. And our school partners are those who are serving low-income students, open admission schools, where we see a host of challenges that come in, and so it really takes a strong collaboration with us and the school to see the success happen.
Thank you. I think we may have time for just one more question. I'm thinking I'm right on the clock. I think we're okay. One more. Oh, I guess not. I see the hand go up. So, well, with that in mind, I guess we're getting ready to transition. Please give a round of applause. Marcy Foster, Erica McConduit Diggs, Jose Luis Santos, Mildred Otero. Very informative. Thank you all. Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Susie Saavedra. I am the Senior Director for Education Policy here at the National Urban League Washington Bureau. We have reached the end of our official program, so I just want to take a few minutes to unpack a little bit of what we covered today in the span of about 5 minutes. We had an amazing 2-hour conversation. Our first panel of students really highlighted for us their personal stories about some of the struggles and barriers they faced to access college and to actually navigate the process and complete with a college degree. Some of the things they mentioned, a need for more guidance counselors, information about the college financial aid process, and how to navigate the college environment once they get to campus. Also, the need for better academic preparation at the K through 12 level, and the fact that a lot of our students are attending dropout factories. As a point of personal privilege, I myself am a first-generation college student. Neither one of my parents had a college degree when they met. They're also immigrants, so I'm a first-generation American. So when I actually, went through the high school or college application process, I really was sort of all alone in the process, and luckily I had some support from random mentors and good people, and God's blessings along the way, but it shouldn't have to be that way. My school graduated a third of its high school class. 99.9% of my classmates were Hispanic. That school system is basically just like one of our panelists, student panelists said, it was a dropout factory. It shouldn't be that way. One of the other issues that is a clear barrier for many of our students and communities is the whole issue of financial aid. And Maisha Challenger with the department came in and gave us some helpful tips about how to navigate the federal student aid process. And we know that there are organizations like the College Success Foundation that provide scholarships and mentoring to students. And our panelists here today in the second panel, Erica McConduit, who is the president and CEO of the Urban League of New Orleans, she runs, and many of our Urban League affiliates run college and career preparation programs where they sit down and they work with students individually to tell them about why it's important to go to college and how to get to college, and more importantly, that they have the potential, they can get to college and graduate, that it's within them. They have the power to do that. And that's sometimes all it takes. We know that some of our student panelists mentioned that, right? Believing in children and validating them is also part of it. So all of us as community members have that role and responsibility to lift a child up in our churches, in our community meetings, in our neighborhoods. I mean, it just something as simple as, I mean, we encounter children all the time, so making sure we lift them up and validate them. Our second panel spoke of the solutions that the National Urban League Washington Bureau highlighted in our higher education report, From Access to Completion, which all of you should have received when you signed in today. Just a few pieces. Our panelists talked about the role of higher education and how it's important to, higher education is the key to economic empowerment, and why it's important for us to invest in solutions that ensure all students, especially underserved students, have equal access to educational opportunities. Again, the programs that the urban leagues offer, there are a number of other nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations that are in your communities offering the type of information, financial information about the financial aid process or the college application process or the supports that your student or child needs to get to college. EdTrust talked a little bit about the work that they've been doing in identifying best practices at colleges and universities to address some of the issues that the students in the first panel mentioned. In particular, our panelists highlighted Florida State University, who has basically been able to coordinate programs and services between the registrar's office, their outreach office, and their enrollment office. So they're now all speaking to one another and making sure no student falls through the cracks. And if they're experiencing difficulty, that everybody has a role in that student's college education. And then lastly, Mildred Otero, who was with the Senate Help Committee, she talked a little bit about the Higher Education Act and where that is today. We know it's going to need to be reauthorized next year. The National Urban League stands ready to continue to partner with members of Congress and policymakers and other advocacy organizations and all of you today to highlight and lift up some of these best practices that we know will help all underserved students, especially African American students, get access to and complete their college education. So thank you all for coming. We hope this information was helpful. Please follow us on Twitter and check our website out. It's also on the back of this report. I'd also like to just forgot to mention again that if you didn't get a chance to pick up the resources that the Department of Education offered, she's still in the back, and you can pick those up on your way out. Thank you.